Hello and welcome everyone. Today we're going to be looking at one of my favorite history channels on YouTube, the Armchair Historian. I've been on a bit of a World War II kick lately, so I'm going to be kind of sticking with that theme and looking at a 7-month-old video titled Germany's Last-Ditch 1945 Units. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, and subscribe. It'd really help out the new channel. Let's get right into it.
Share History TV for free using the code FREEHOLIDAY for 100% off of your first month. It is April 1945. Old men hunker down behind makeshift barricades in the streets of besieged Berlin. Besides them, teenage boys clutch rifles and Panzerfausts. This motley collection of old and young are serving in the Volkssturm, the People's Militia. It was part of Germany's broader effort to raise new military and paramilitary formations and desperately halt the Red Army's invasion of the Reich. Adolf Hitler called on the German people to deepen their commitment to winning the war. Even
in my research, I was able to see that the official call was for men and boys ages 60 to 16, and that really wasn't always the case. You know, they went younger than 16, they went older than 60. It was kind of really just they wanted anyone that was able to fight at this point of the war, and of course they were running desperately low on that. I was able to see that they also actually used the Hitler Youth, which was obviously younger than 16, and I was able to find that there was a young boy who was 12 years old. His name was Alfred Zeck, and he received the Iron Cross for rescuing injured German soldiers from the advancing Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front.
When defeat appeared imminent, Hitler and his inner circle of advisors realized that by mid-1944, the Third Reich faced overwhelming odds in defense of the Reich. Time was running short to reverse their losses. Germany's strength would have to be mustered to salvage the situation. Victory meant saving the Reich from imminent destruction, and to do this, Germany moved to wage total war. Every man, woman, and child would be expected to contribute. Saving the Reich was no easy feat. The Western Allies and Soviet Union agreed to only accept Germany's unconditional surrender. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army routed the Wehrmacht, reoccupying most of the Soviet territory taken during the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa. The degraded army groups on the Eastern Front struggled to offer effective resistance. In December 1944, the Soviets threatened to isolate the Baltic states and roll over the occupied territories in Poland and Czechoslovakia. On the Western Front, Allied armies broke out from the Normandy landings and swept eastward.
Even before D-Day, the Germans were being consistently pushed back on the Eastern Front, really after Stalingrad. They were low on men, they were low on resources. They did not have anywhere near the men or resources to properly fortify France for a landing that they knew was coming eventually. Really, it was hopeless. There's different arguments on when they lost the war. Some people will say really is when America declared war in 1941. It was after Stalingrad, but I really would think it's after Stalingrad because they desperately needed those resources, and they really needed to get the Soviet Union out of the war, and they weren't able to do that, so really it was just a steady defeat after that point.
Captured Paris and the Low Countries and toppled the Vichy French government. Allied forces crawled northward on the Italian peninsula too. By the end of 1944, American and British forces were poised to cross the Rhine and invade the German heartland. Taking in the bleak prospect of invasion, Hitler and the German leadership had few attractive options. Submission to inferior races was not an option. Fighting to
And that's it right there, because their whole agenda was to portray them as a superior race, and they knew that they would lose power the second that they admitted defeat in any way. So they kind of had no choice but to fight to the end, which a lot of the people in Germany were kind of woke up to by this point. They kind of the German high rankings, they used propaganda still to try to enforce authority and invoke fear, and they did it very successfully pretty much until the end. But it's just their last like dying atrocity that they committed in my eyes, to just allow their people to be slaughtered, even though they knew defeat was completely unavoidable by this time.
The end was the only choice, but questions remained as to who would fight. The Führer distrusted the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. The Air Force lost at the Battle of Britain and failed to turn the fortunes of war on the Eastern Front. Worse, they had been unable to stop the strategic bombing of German cities. The army also failed. Its generals presented Hitler with catastrophic defeats. Operation Valkyrie, the plot to assassinate Hitler and seize control of the Reich, furthered Hitler's distrust of the army. Since the
That's something that's really not talked about enough, is the amount of assassination attempts on Hitler's life throughout the war. I've seen numbers in the ballpark of 50 like official real attempts, and a vast majority of them were done by his own people, and mostly people in his military, high-ranking people in his military. Valkyrie is obviously probably the most well-known attempt, but there were many other attempts, like trying to put bombs on his car, his plane. They tried to poison him. There was even attempts to try to just get close to him, just to outright kill him, no matter the consequences.
state apparatus could not be trusted. The answer instead lay in the very organization that had given them power, the Nazi Party. On October 18, 1944, Heinrich Himmler announced the formation of a people's militia, the Volkssturm. Hitler ordered party chancellery leader Martin Bormann to raise a militia of those aged 16 to 60, including the injured. Through local and regional party leaders, Hitler expected to raise 6 million men to reinforce the eastern and western fronts. He believed that militia troops would fight to protect their homes and hold out until the last man died. To further bolster the ranks, Bormann and Hitler called upon 500,000 members of the Hitler Youth.
And they kind of weren't wrong that people were going to be willing to fight to defend their houses and their homes. They used propaganda to invoke fear to their people, because they kind of were rightfully so scared of the retaliation of the Soviet army because of what the Germans did as they pushed east. I won't get too far into that, but you can only imagine what they did. They did terrible things to their homes and the people of the Soviet Union, and they were scared to get that in return. And so a lot of men, older, younger boys, even women, were willing to fight to the death because they were just scared of the retaliation of the Soviets. And you hear a lot of stories of a lot of their people running west as fast as they can when the Soviets are advancing, because they just did not want to surrender to the Soviets. I went ahead and skipped ahead because there was kind of a lengthy ad for their channel and their website. But like I said before, the Armchair Historian is one of my favorite channels on YouTube, and if you haven't checked them out yet, I highly recommend it.
Most older members of the Volkssturm trained for about 2 weeks on weeknights and Saturdays. The training itself was of inconsistent quality because most of their time in training was spent on military discipline rather than combat maneuvers. As for weaponry, recruits were taught to use an assortment of rifles and anti-tank weapons. The Volkssturm fell short of expectations. While the image of 6 million men under arms was undoubtedly impressive, it was never a reality.
I've seen numbers that say that they were only able to really raise roughly 60,000 militiamen to go up against 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, and that's just on the Eastern Front. They were severely undertrained, like they just said. They didn't have the military resources that the regular military had, and a lot of them were injured, old, or too young to fight. So it's just delusional that they had any chance. And like I said before, it's just the last real great atrocity that Hitler and his high-ranking officials committed, was sending their people out there just to be slaughtered when they had absolutely no chance.
Some Germans evaded conscription, and a few party bosses who had no stomach for fighting shirked in their duties to assemble or lead militia recruits. The Volkssturm personnel that did fight often did so without sufficient weapons or supplies. and the Wehrmacht prioritized giving arms and ammunition to frontline army units, not the militia. In practice, the militia fell under the command of the Wehrmacht, not the party. The army had the weapons, supplies, and expertise that the Nazi Party lacked. With army leadership, they fought as infantry formations and proved combat effective. Despite the army's support, the Volkssturm struggled to hold back the tide of Allied forces from both the east and west. It is estimated that parts of the Volkssturm sustained 70 to 80% casualties. Outside the army's command, Volkssturm formations often broke when Allied armies pressured them. Many of the men and boys just wanted to go home. The German leadership prepared for occupation if the Volkssturm failed. Intelligence and security services, under the SS's supervision, would form a guerrilla resistance force called Werewolf. Originally designated Operation Werewolf in 1944, SS troopers would lead commando-style sabotage and assassination missions behind enemy lines or in recently occupied Allied territories.
Yeah, to me this just seems like, Plan C. These type of things like the people militia and these guerrilla warfare tactics, they would work and help if the regular army was having some sort of success. But this just seems, just layers on layers of delusion by this point.
These werewolves would also kill any Germans collaborating with occupiers if the need arose. The first iteration of the werewolf plan fell through, as no one formed a command structure. But the idea gained a second lease on life. Joseph Goebbels crafted propaganda messages throughout 1945 to inspire the German people to join the werewolf movement. Leaning heavily into mythological imagery, violence, and revenge, the propaganda minister envisioned a resistance movement designed to invoke fear and terror in the Allies. Werewolf men and women were to blend into the population and kill occupiers. The insurgency would wear down and terrify the Allied powers. With an Allied retreat, the werewolf groups would restore the German Reich. While the Allies certainly believed that the movement might represent a real threat and were on the lookout for any potential insurgency, the werewolf movement never panned out. Aside from occasional potshots at occupying troops or the murder of German collaborators, no mass underground resistance fought the occupation. Civilians were war-weary and showed little enthusiasm to fight to the last man or woman. The Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine, for their part, hoped to equip new formations with the Wunderwaffe to even the odds against numerically superior foes. The Luftwaffe rushed jet fighters into the air. Plans for stealth fighters or bombers that could evade Allied radar detection were proposed for full service.
In my research to prepare for this video, I looked into different numbers of like what percentage left they had of stuff like the Army and Luftwaffe and stuff like that. And their Air Force, they only had roughly 10% of their aircraft left. So really, they had no chance. I mean, they were unable to rebuild. And the Allies, by this point of the war, America especially, was able to just produce aircraft at record pace. They perfected it by this point. So the Germans didn't have any resources to rebuild, and they didn't have the time or the manpower to train new pilots when they lost them. So it's just, you have to sparingly use them at this point of the war, and they were in no position to be sparingly used. They had to kind of throw Hail Marys and hope that it lands, because they were just being swallowed by both sides. They had to hit where they could, and they just couldn't be careful enough to preserve their resources.
Cutting-edge technology, however, could not overcome low reserves of fuel and raw materials, or the loss of experienced pilots. Though they took heavy personnel and aircraft losses during the war, the Luftwaffe command pooled its resources to destroy American and British bomber wings stationed on airfields in the Netherlands, Belgium, and France during Operation Bodenplatte. They intended to destroy the bombers on the ground rather than in the air. In secret, night fighters, ground attack bombers, jet fighters, and propeller fighters moved into position to assault the airfields on New Year's Day, 1945. commanders assumed correctly that the Allied pilots might be hungover from the previous night's festivities and would not expect an attack. Hundreds of German aircraft took to the skies shortly after the dawn of January 1st, 1945. They had the advantage of surprise and avoided Allied radar. They even surprised friendly anti-aircraft emplacements, some of which opened fire and brought down the vulnerable planes. As planned, Luftwaffe ground attack craft and fighters destroyed Allied bombers on the ground at some of the targeted airfields. Others, due to faulty intelligence, were empty. German losses were significant as well. For every bomber destroyed on the tarmac, Operation Bodenplatte's air forces lost equal numbers of craft and crew.
Yeah, on paper that might seem like a draw, but this is one of those Hail Marys that I was just talking about that on paper it seems like a great opportunity to attack while they're on the ground and potentially not expecting an attack, but to lose an equal number is it's a loss at the end of the day, because like I said before, America was able to produce these aircraft faster and they had the resources to do so, so they would just replace these destroyed aircraft, whereas Germany couldn't.
The aftermath of Bodenplatte saw Luftwaffe commanders resorting to unconventional tactics. The lack of an effective bombing wing and a shortage of competent pilots to defend Germany's skies forced the Luftwaffe and its test squadron, Kampfgeschwader 200, to develop experimental systems. These included the V-1 flying bombs, manned suicide rocket planes like the Fieseler Fi-103R, and planned ramming gliders, among many other projects.
I don't really know about the ramming gliders, but the V-1 flying bomb is actually a really great innovation during the war. It's actually like the first cruise missile that was ever used in warfare. And a cool story is my grandma actually was a little girl in England at the time of the war, and she lived in Wimbledon, just outside of London. So her area sustained a lot of bombing by the Germans, and one of these V-1 flying bombs actually hit at the end of her street. There was a cardboard factory, I believe it was. Her neighborhood was kind of lined with factories, and it destroyed the factory, and I think it killed two of her neighbors that were her family's close friends during the war. So it did some decent damage in England during the war.
Technical problems and the destruction of manufacturing facilities prevented most test aircraft from reaching mass production. Consistent waves of Allied air attacks was another problem. Thousands of bombers engaged in raids against German cities. Anger over Allied strategic bombing fueled a desire for revenge and inspired undertrained pilots to volunteer for doomed one-way attack missions. Starting in 1945, the Luftwaffe employed aerial ramming as an intentional tactic against long-range bombers. A task force called Sonderkommando Elbe undertook such a mission. Unable to destroy the bombers on the ground or in the air, the Luftwaffe collected a group of some 120 Bf-109s. On April 7, 1945, the task force engaged an oncoming wave of American B-17 and B-24 bombers. Instead of trying to take down the bombers with machine guns or cannons, the German fighters rammed and destroyed 22 aircraft. The ramming tactic had been theorized months before the mission, and the Luftwaffe planned on using steel-reinforced rocket gliders to ram enemy planes. The gliders never made it into full production, and the remaining option was to use conventional fighters. Though
I knew about the kamikaze fighters used in Japan, and I really didn't know much about this. It just seems, the same thing in Japan. They didn't have the resources to rebuild. They didn't have the skilled pilots to replace. So I know they just said that they used unskilled pilots for this, but it just seems like so useless because they didn't have the resources to rebuild. They didn't have the manpower to just throw away like that. So it just seems so delusional to do something like this at this point of the war.
Encouraged to jump out of the aircraft and parachute to safety, most German pilots died en route. The task force downed 13 bombers while losing 53 of theirs. the Allies still controlled the skies over Germany, and the bomber wings continued their raids. This would not be the only suicidal air attack force the Luftwaffe deployed. In 1944, the Leonidas Squadron solicited volunteers to fly the human-guided rocket-propelled flying bombs. The technological complexity and the potential loss of pilots forced the Luftwaffe to disband the unit during that same year. Months later, in 1945, the desperate situation during the Battle of Berlin, however, revived the Leonidas Squadron. But by this point, the pilots were left with barely any resources, only leaving them access to what little aircraft was left, and with only enough fuel for a one-way trip to attack enemy forces. From April 17th to April 20th, 1945, the pilots of the Leonidas Squadron dove their planes headlong into the bridges over the Oder River to deny the Red Army's passage. Their kamikaze-style attacks ended when the Red Army seized the airfield from which the squadron had taken off. German command claimed the squadron destroyed 17 bridges, though other sources indicated that the effort destroyed one bridge. For its part, the Kriegsmarine in 1945 was severely degraded, but improved U-boats and small unit tactics promised to take the fight to the Allied naval forces. Under Karl Donitz's supervision, the Kriegsmarine hurried the production of the Elektrobude. Designed and first constructed in 1943, these U-boats used a hybrid diesel-electric motor system and a snorkel that allowed them to remain underwater for far longer than previous models.
Yeah, I've read a little bit about these. I'm very interested in U-boat history. But by this point of the war, it's the same thing as their aircraft. They had lost a lot of U-boats. Even with this innovation, they didn't have the resources to build enough of these to make any real difference. And the Allies also had the technology to hunt and destroy these U-boats a lot easier than they did in the beginning of the war. 1942 U-boats kind of wreaked havoc on Allied shipping, and they just hadn't done that in 1943 and 44. It just slowed down exponentially. So this seems just, again, it seems desperate and useless in my opinion that they would have any type of success with that at this point. And even if they're able to use the U-boats to slow down the Western Front supplies and things like that, the Soviet Union was pushing in so fast in the East that it was just useless to put resources into something like this, in my opinion.
They were designed to fight submerged. It allowed them to more efficiently evade Allied air attacks and anti-submarine warfare ships. Donitz hoped to repeat the successes of the early phases of the war, cripple the Allied supply lines, and force the invasion armies to a halt. Though advanced in design, the Kriegsmarine did not launch enough of these U-boat variants to make much of a difference so late in the war. With most of the surface fleet defeated or tied up supporting the Wehrmacht's fighting retreat in the Baltic states, the Navy resorted to commando units. Known as the K-Verband, these small units employed explosive speedboats, divers, and mini-submarines. These Navy men were to be an elite force, using highly motivated and trained personnel and experimental weapons to undertake high-risk missions. Their first major action was in 1944, where K-Verband units were deployed to blunt the Allied landings at Anzio, Italy, using diver-driven torpedoes. By 1945, the K-Verband consisted of flotillas of mini-submarine and speedy explosive-tipped motorboats that attempted to ambush Allied supply and smaller warships in the English Channel, North Sea, and Baltic Sea. Despite
those waters are notoriously rough, so it just seems kind of weird to use smaller craft. I know that their whole tactics, a lot of their warfare tactics were to use small forces, get in and get out, but smaller vessels in those waters couldn't have fared well. It's just really rough seas up there.
Daring and bravery of the small attack craft's crew, they found only occasional victories. Their mini-subs and manner torpedoes suffered constant mechanical problems. Poor weather, rough sea conditions, well-armed and armored Allied warships, and air attacks blunted the K-Verband's effectiveness. K-Verband's personnel were more likely to lose their lives in poor weather or sea conditions than to enemy ships or planes. The K-Verband's sabotage, engineering, and diving components assisted the German armed forces' defense by demolishing bridges underwater on both the eastern and western fronts. Those units destroyed some of the bridges they were tasked with, but often suffered equipment failures and heavy casualties. Their efforts, though brave, did little to stop the Allied army's invasion into the Reich. Germany's last-ditch units, at times, demonstrated the commitment and ingenuity of its armed forces. However, fanaticism and new weapons was not enough to turn back the tide of Allied and Soviet armies swarming into the Reich. Rather, the Volkssturm and Werewolf movement proved how Hitler and his cohorts were willing to risk the lives of their citizens for a deluded notion of victory that would never come. Don't forget to check out armchairhistory.com.
I'll go ahead and stop it right there, but he said it best at the end there. I mean, a lot of things came out of this. It was a lot of delusion and a horrible last notion to have your people slaughtered. They had no chance against the advancing Allies. But a few great innovations did come out of this. You know, they were desperate. The V-1 flying bomb, the U-boat innovations they're impressive, but they didn't have the resources to back up those innovations. They didn't have the manpower. They had nothing. It really was just no hope. It was hopeless. But you know, their whole notion of propaganda, superiority, and stuff like that, they couldn't even accept anything other than success. So it really was a great concoction of, you know, slaughtering the German people. You have to feel bad for a lot of these people that were brainwashed with the propaganda. It's not all the Germans were bad in that way. I'm not defending them in any way whatsoever here. I don't want to get that confused, but you do have to feel bad for a lot of the German people who didn't have anything to do with it and who were forced to, you know, give up their lives for nothing. But yeah, I really enjoyed making this video. I learned a whole lot, and I hope you did too. And if you'd like to see more, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.